Good morning, everybody, and a really very warm welcome to Butterfly Conservation's annual Moth Recorders Meeting. It really is a pleasure to see so many of you here today. It's wonderful to see you popping up in the chat, telling us where you are. And it's also really great to welcome both long-standing experts and those perhaps who may be joining us today who are newer to moth recording. So whether you spend your nights running light traps, poring over micro moths at the kitchen table, or have just had your interest roused by a moth encounter, this meeting this morning is definitely for you. Moths are an astonishingly rich and diverse group, representing much of our Lepidoptera. Yet for much of the public, and even within wider conservation circles, they remain less visible than butterflies. And so that makes the work that you do as recorders even more important. Because without your dedication, patience, expertise, we simply would not know what is happening to moth populations across the UK. Your records form the backbone of the National Moth Recording Scheme, and today's meeting is an opportunity to hear about progress, share learning, and explore how that evidence is shaping nature recovery. It's also a chance to connect research, recording, and real-world impact, linking what you observe on the ground to the bigger picture of nature recovery. You all know that we are living through a critical time for nature. The evidence is clear that insects are under pressure from habitat loss, climate change, pollution, and land use change. Moths, because of their sheer diversity and sensitivity to environmental change, are among our most powerful indicators of how nature is responding. When moth populations change, they are often telling us something fundamental about the health of ecosystems as a whole. And this is where your role as recorders becomes central to nature recovery. Reliable long-term data allows us to move beyond anecdote and assumption. It helps us identify which species are declining, which are recovering, and where conservation action is having an impact. Your records absolutely shape conservation priorities. They influence land management decisions, and they support policies aimed at reversing biodiversity loss. At Butterfly Conservation, we are increasingly focused on turning evidence into action, and the National Moth Recording Scheme is critical to that ambition. Data gathered by you underpins our state of the UK's moths analyses, it supports species recovery plans, and it helps us track progress against our strategic goals. Moths also feature prominently in the government's species abundance target, which focuses on increasing overall populations rather than simply preventing extinctions. Nature recovery is not an abstract concept. It happens in real places at local scale, often driven by committed individuals and communities. And county moth recorders play a vital role here, acting as experts, mentors, and advocates. Your knowledge supports local authorities, it informs planning decisions, it guides agri-environment schemes, and it helps organisations target habitat restoration where it can make the greatest difference. So you've already heard a little bit from Richard about the agenda today, but it does reflect the breadth and strength of this work. And as Richard has said, we're going to begin by giving an update on the National Moth Recording Scheme, highlighting progress, developments and future priorities. We're going to hear about magnificent moths that continue to inspire curiosity and commitment, and about target conservation work, including progress on priority moth species in Northern Ireland. We're going to be hearing from a range of experts, bringing different perspectives from practical recording insights to cutting-edge ecological research. And a talk on urbanisation and pollinators reminds us that nature recovery is not just a rural issue, but one that must be woven into towns and cities, the everyday landscapes where most people live. And I'm particularly pleased that today's meeting is open to anybody interested in moths. And one of our strengths as a conservation movement is the way it brings together professionals, passionate volunteers, researchers, and expert amateurs. And we need that diversity of experience and viewpoint if we are to meet the scale of the challenge that lies ahead of us. Before I hand back to Richard, I just want to say a really huge thank you. Recording moths takes time, skill, commitment. It's often carried out quietly and without much public recognition, but the impact of your work is profound. You are providing the evidence base for nature recovery, helping us measure success, helping us learn from failures and make better decisions for the future of biodiversity. And Butterfly Conservation is proud to work alongside you, and we are committed to strengthening the support, the tools and the partnerships that make moth recording possible. We have seen some changes in our biological data team in the last 12 months, and we've recruited cover for Claire while she's on maternity leave, who's going to be staying on beyond our return, beyond Claire's return, to help with the data backlog. So please, please keep submitting your data so it's available for all the vital reasons that I've already mentioned. Together, we can ensure that moths are not only better understood, but better protected, and that their recovery becomes a visible part of the wider recovery. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found the meeting informative, inspiring, and that it is rewarding for you. And I'm now really pleased to hand back over to Richard for the rest of the morning. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay, I will start with doing the update for the National Moth Recording Scheme. Firstly, I just want to touch on the changes that we've had in our team over the past 12 months. So those of you who have attended our meetings over the past few years will be familiar with Zoe and Les. Zoe was in the role of Senior Surveys Officer for 18 years at BC, and she left last spring, and I stepped into the role as Recording Schemes Officer. And Les was also a long-standing member of BC staff as a Senior Data Officer. And last summer, Claire Pascaresti stepped into the role as Biological Data Officer. So we just want to say a big thank you really to Zoe and Les for all of their hard work over the past 18 years and everything they've done for the moth community. I just wanted to start also by showing a little bit of the data that we currently are looking at in terms of the moth recording scheme. So the National Moth Recording Scheme was set up in 2007 and holds over 43 million records. The data is used by Butterfly Conservation to monitor the status of UK moth populations. I wanted to use this graph to illustrate how the increase in moth recording has occurred over the past 10 years. We've seen a consistent increase, and this saw a particular jump in 2020. This really reflects the increase in biological recording throughout the pandemic, but the growth continues after this, and you can see in the green bar, which is the records for last year, another significant increase for 2025. This is probably also down to more favourable weather conditions in 2025 compared to 2024, but it would strongly suggest there's more people out there recording moths than ever before. My next graph is really wanting to look at when do people observe and record moths. I thought it was interesting to kind of observe the peaks and troughs of biological recording throughout the year, and these are using records from 2025. Whilst the results are not particularly surprising, with the peaks being in the summer months and the troughs being in the winter months, there's something interesting to note that actually moth recording can occur throughout the whole of the year, all through the 12 months, and the way of recording moth signs, even in the winter, as I'll discuss next. So rather than having a presentation that's completely full of graphs and tables, I wanted to show some photos as well of our amazing moths. And I thought I'd highlight a few moths that you can see at a particular time of year. So I know many of you have been moth recording for years, if not decades, but for those of you who are new into moth recording, it might be interesting to have a look at which moths you're more likely to see at which times of year. So I'll start with January and February. I thought I'd highlight the golden pygmy, which had the highest number of records in January 2025. Now, the example here I've shown is an adult, but actually you won't see an adult in January because they don't fly until May. But what you can observe in January is their signs. So they're actually leaf miners in bramble, and those are signs you're more likely to record at this time of year. However, the winter moth, as the name may suggest, is adept at surviving in winter months, and including surviving freezing temperatures. So you will see adults at this time of year of the winter moth. Similarly, you will also see the pale brindle beauty and the dotted border. But for those examples, you will only see the males as the females are flightless. I just want to say thank you to all of the photographers included in this presentation. I think they really bring the moths to life and they are fantastic. These are three fantastic examples in March and April. The common quaker flies from March through to May in one generation. This is a common species and you can easily recognize it through the rounded tip forewing and the large rounded pale outlined oval and kidney mark on their forewings. The Hebrew character is also very distinctive as well, and you can see in the photograph that distinctive black mark on the forewing, which is very unique to moths flying at this time of year. And the clouded drab, despite the name, can actually be quite colourful, including the photo I've chosen today. It can be sort of orange and pink, and not just drab in colour. But they're very variable throughout their range, throughout the United Kingdom. And they fly from March through to May. In May and June, we start to see moths that are slightly more distinctive and recognisable. The heart and dart, I think it's also a great photo to illustrate the central dart mark, which is narrow and a solid black line. This also flies from May through to July, and it's readily attracted to light. The treble lines obviously has its name from those three lines across its wings, and also flies from May through to July. It is also readily attracted to sugar and light, and is a species really connected with woodland fringes, hedgerows, and commons. Now, one of those recognisable moths probably in this country is the cinnabar moth, and I thought I'd include a photo here of both the adult and larvae form because they're both so distinctive. It really resembles no other British species except perhaps the burnets, but it's very common across most of Britain. It's actually more nocturnal, but can be disturbed in the daytime as well. And the larvae, as you probably all know, feeds on ragwort. Heading into the peak months of July and August, we see the large yellow underwing come into prominence at this time of year. In fact, it's really attracted to light, and you often find hundreds arriving at the moth trap at this time of year. It exhibits a wide range of colour forms, but what's really consistent are those yellow hind wings bordered with the black. The Jersey tiger, meanwhile, has really captured attention in the past year. We saw a significant increase in its both number and distribution last year. This was noted in the big butterfly count. And BC received hundreds of emails, inquiries with both photos and videos of the Jersey tiger. So this charismatic moth is really probably a fantastic way of introducing people into moth recording, because it's also a daytime flight as well, so you're more likely to see it in your gardens. The main flight period is from July to September. And finally, the riband wave. This is also a very common species throughout the UK, but it tends to fly between June and August. It sometimes has a second brood in the south in the autumn. The typical form has its dark band across all four wings, and the larvae feeds on dock and dandelion. Now, going into September and October, the larger underwing maintains its prominence at this time of year. In fact, it's the most recorded moth between July and October. The two rustic examples here are both also striking. The square spot rustic is an abundant species that's variable in colour and pattern, and again it has this pale outlined square kidney mark, which is a conspicuous diagnostic characteristic. And this only flies in usually one generation from late July into early October. The black rustic is also a very distinctive moth and is common throughout the south. The adults can be seen feeding on flowers of ivy and even overripe blackberries. This flies in one generation from September to October and slightly earlier in the north. And finally, heading to November and December, again, also very striking moths at this time of year. The light brown apple moth is actually originally an Australian species that was introduced into Cornwall in the 1930s. It's since spread northwards very quickly and is now common in many parts of the UK. The feathered thorn is unlike any other moth that's flying late in the year. It's got that rich reddish brown colour on its wings, and the males have a broadly feathered antennae. This moth flies from mid-September right through till December. And finally, the December moth, again, a fantastic photograph there. This flight time actually can be found as early as October, but again, obviously, as per its name, flies into December as well. It's got those sort of charcoal grey-brown in colour wings with wavy, creamy white markings on top as well. The females are much larger than the males, and the adults are incapable of feeding. These fly at night and are readily attracted to light. Okay, I would like to return a little bit to the data. So this graph shows the top 10 species recorded in 2025. Now, the data itself is only using one data source here, which is the NMRS online. So the true figures are much higher, but they do reflect the general trend of 2025, whereby, as I mentioned before, the large yellow underwing has really outscored any other moth by quite some distance. Also, you can see moths there that I featured in the previous slides, such as heart and dart, and the cinnabar moth as well, and ribbon wave, all feature in the top 10 across the UK. However, there are some variations across the four nations. I thought I'd quickly touch on the differences and highlight the different species that feature. For example, in Scotland, we have the silver ground carpet. Here, the wings can vary from white to brownish white, with a central band varying width and shade. This can also be easily disturbed from vegetation during the day and edges of woodland rides. This flies from dusk and into the night, and they fly from May until July. But as you can see, larger underwing features heavily as well at the top of the list for Scotland. Heading into Northern Ireland, I'd like to focus on the dark arches. Again, a beautiful example here. Again, they can be very variable in colour, but they are easily recognised by that conspicuous oval and kidney mark and the W-shaped mark near the outer edge of the forewings. This moth flies from July to August. In England, we have a really striking moth, the Willow Beauty, featuring in the top 5. This photo just demonstrates just how well camouflaged it is. They like to rest on tree trunks during the day, and at night they feed on flowers such as ragwort and creeping thistle. The moths fly from July to August and sometimes in September in the south of England. And finally to Wales. Again, you may have noticed all four countries have a large yellow underwing at the top of the list, but brimstone moth is not too far behind in Wales, and this is obviously a very striking moth, very distinctive, bright yellow with chestnut brown markings on the tips. And this moth flies from April to October, so a long flight period. The caterpillars of this moth feed on blackthorn, hawthorn, and rowan. I'd like to reflect slightly on the data set status that we have at the moment. As has been mentioned, we have had various staff changes and technical changes, so there's kind of but some delay on the process of our data. So what these pie charts represent, if you can see the green areas, they indicate all the areas that the data has been received and has been entered into the national database. The orange areas indicate where data has been received and it's currently in the local database, but not part of the national picture. And the blue areas indicate where data has not yet been received. However, I would like to note that the orange area of the 2024 figures is probably much bigger now because we have received a fair amount of data since this was compiled. So I'd just like to take a note to say a huge thank you to everyone who's contributed in both recording and verifying moth records. Obviously, we're very grateful for your efforts, and this contributes to the incredible resource that we have. So we do have a plan for 2026. So as I mentioned, Claire Pasquetti has recently gone on maternity leave, but we are in recruitment for the new biological data support officer who will be in post for 12 months. So they will continue with Claire's work with the backlog of imports and following all the new guidelines and supporting county recorders. Once Claire returns in July, we'll then have a greater capacity in the team This would provide an opportunity to modernise data flows, improve the database structure, and enhance support for county recorders. So our news section has a fantastic regular updates on moths about the latest research and projects. We also have a YouTube channel with many educational videos, including this one about the pebbled moth. So pebbled moths are normally white with black specks, as you can see the example on the right-hand side, making them well camouflaged against lichen. However, in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution killed off many lichens and blackened urban tree trunks and walls. So the video really explains the impact of this environmental change and how the species responded. You can also sign up to our science newsletter, and I'll put the link in our chat. There's lots of moth-related articles in there, so I would strongly encourage you to read that. And also, I'd like to showcase the Discover and Learn webpage that we have. There's lots of information about Lepidoptera on this webpage, and it's a great resource to attract young people into recording Lepidoptera. There are also fantastic books and guides to help us in moth recording. Obviously, the two I've showcased here you may have already known about, the Field Guide to Micromoths and the Concise Guide to Moths. These are both fantastic resources for moth recording. But I'd also like to showcase the Field Guide to Smaller Moths and Great Britain and Ireland. They may be on the call, Mark Young and Steve Palmer put together the previous version, which was published in 2018. Mark Cubitt has come on board, and they've now published the 4th edition of this. So this is available as a PDF file, but it's also a fully searchable Excel-based version and an app version, which is also searchable, that runs on Android phones. So we'll put the link in the chat to download this. It's free to download, so I would strongly recommend if you are getting into moth recording to have a look at that. And I'd also like to mention the eMoth newsletter, which is sent out every 6 months, is also covering all moth news, and we'll put a link to how you can sign up to that as well. And finally, I'd just like to touch on some social media success that we've had at BC. So you may have watched it, or you definitely have heard about it if you haven't watched it, but Celebrity Traitors in October was the most watched programme of the year in the UK, with 15 million viewers. So the communications and brand marketing teams came together to put together this campaign to highlight moths and obviously compare moths to Claudia's outfits, and they reached over 217,000 people, receiving 17,000 likes and 6,000 shares. And in total, the content that across all platforms was seen by over 600,000 people. So it was just fantastic and innovative way to connect more people to moths, and again, just highlight what amazing photographs we've got, and encourage people to learn more about moths. So that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to everyone in the moth recording community and everyone on the call today. Your data is invaluable to us, and we look forward to another year of record-breaking numbers in 2026. Thank you.
I've got a couple of questions for you, Richard. Have you got time to answer them now, or would you prefer to move on and answer them in the chat?
Yeah, I can answer them now. I'm just trying to...
Okey-dokey. So one question is, do your most recorded species tables that you featured, are they including micro moths, or is that just macro moths from the NMRS online data?
Sorry, the data sets are combined for both micro and macro moths.
That's lovely, thank you. So yeah, so both types of moths in those graphs. And we also had a comment in the chat, which I thought you might want to respond on, which was that perhaps volunteering to help with the data import as well as the recording could be useful. So yeah, we have made we have had some volunteer support in that. It's obviously very specialist type of support that we'd require for that. But yes, if you wanted to add a little bit more to that.
Sorry, can I just double check I've stopped sharing my screen because I can't see. Okay, great. Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, that's right. So somebody had commented in the chat that perhaps actually, given the data backlog, maybe there would be a need for volunteers to support the data entry as much as the verification and the recording. And as that is something that we have recently got some specialist volunteer support on, I thought perhaps you'd want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we really want to emphasize that whilst we are currently obviously recruiting for support in our team, we really want to encourage continued entry of data. What's fantastic is we've got more moth verification assistants now. We're growing our team in terms of the support we have in verification of records. So yeah, data is incredibly valuable to us. So we'd encourage you to record at any time of year. And as I said, we've got a plan for 2026 in terms of dealing with the backlog. So yes, yeah, hopefully this day will encourage more people to record moths, and we'd like to encourage to spread that out to a wider audience.
Thanks, Richard. And can I add in a question on top of that as well, which is in terms of the number of records coming in and the increase. I know that you work obviously closely with the verification community, and that in order to keep pace with that, they've got some technological things that they do to help, but also teamwork. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how that works before we move on to Rebecca.
Yes, I mean, a lot of our county moth recorders are, we're working sort of a team of one, but what we're doing at the moment is we're trying to encourage sort of team working and separating out those roles, because as I showed in the sort of fourth slide, we're getting more and more records coming through in various forms, not just one source of data. So it is a bigger workload for our county moth recorders. So we're now encouraging more team-based working, having verification teams and separating out those different data sources so we can kind of tackle that data more easily across, and it's not so reliant on one person dealing with all that data coming in. Okay, I think we can hand over now to Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Richard. Okay, welcome everyone to your Moth Detective training course. I am Rebecca, the South East England ecologist, and I'm going to be going through 4 of our moth mysteries that we're trying to uncover in the South East at the moment. And at Butterfly Conservation, we have our highest priority list of moth cases that we work on in a targeted, species-focused way. And there are lots of moths where we already have a good understanding of what they need, and so we can work on a project like the Kent's Magnificent Moths that I've come from to share advice on the best ways to create habitat and increase monitoring to track how these species' fortunes are changing over time. But we do have our problem priority species, the long unsolved cold case mystery moths, where we go to find out information about what their needs and up-to-date distributions are, and you end up with quite a lot of questions. So many questions and gaps in the current knowledge, and that some detective work is going to be required before we can confidently go to the people managing the sites for these moths and say, here's what this moth needs. If you create this specific habitat, we know the moths will come. And these 3 moths remain on our priority list going into the next few seasons with mysteries to unravel. But for the next 4 moths I'm going to feature for you, progress is being made and the mysteries are that little bit closer to being solved. So Richard's already featured this book, and if you have the 2nd edition of the Micro Moth book, you may have noticed our colourful yellow and pink cover star hiding down here, which Phil and Mark have kindly given us the new name, the Milkwort Beauty. But for people that don't use those, Hypercalia citrinalis is a micro moth. We know it feeds on milkwort plants, but this moth has never been very common in the UK. It was previously recorded across several chalk grasslands in North Kent and across the Downs, but then the species declined, probably due to scrub encroaching on their habitat, and we feared it was lost from the UK because its last sighting was in 1979. But I should say that it still survives in the Burren in Ireland, and you can still see it there too. But there is hope for us here as well. The milkworт beauty was rediscovered by accident by a Kent Wildlife Trust volunteer working at a site in North Kent. But since then, some people have gone to see it, of course, because it's very nice looking, but only a few individuals were being recorded each year. Moth trap attempts were only getting about 10 individuals. And if your moth only has one population, and that's very small, that makes your moth quite vulnerable to going nationally extinct. And of course, we don't want that. So we needed to figure out how large was their population to determine whether it needed extra help keeping going, or whether it was big enough that we could look at other sites around to see whether there was suitable habitat they could be encouraged to take up there. And we want to know exactly what their requirements are. Is it just any kind of milkwort, or are they being more specific than that? And once we know what they want, can we look in the surrounding landscape and try and link up that habitat availability for them? So in 2024, we came onto the site during the day, sweeped around with long sticks to encourage them to fly up from the habitat, and we got 12 adults. But if you were moth recording in 2024, you'll probably recall it wasn't the best year for recording a lot of moths. So we decided we'd try again. Everyone brought all of their pots, and we tried to pot up all of our moths to find out how many we could find in a peak count across their flight period. And you could say we found slightly more than 12. We now know when their peak is. We know there's a lot more of them than we thought. And we're now more confident that this site is providing good habitat for them. So if we study the habitat that they're using here, it gives us a good indication of what they actually need, and we can look to replicate that in other areas for them as well. So we have more questions. Why are there quite so many more in 2025? Is it just because the weather's better, or is it because the management of the site was also slightly different to the previous year, and it could have been a better timing for them? We don't really know enough about their complete life cycle to know yet, but we'll be back next year to try and figure that out. So what are their requirements? The book said they could use both common milkwort and chalk milkwort. But when we actually went to find larvae, we found they were only using common milkwort. There was chalk milkwort, but it was generally shorter, not growing quite as abundantly, and they weren't using it. You can see there's also a little bit of scrub behind these nice blue milkwort plants, and we were consistently finding the larvae were close to this little bit of shelter of the small scrub saplings coming up within the chalk grassland habitat, and they were also quite near to the established blocks of scrub and woodland around the edges of the site, providing that shelter. But why is that? Does the caterpillar need that? Or is it more to do with our adults? Because if you're a nice, colourful looking moth, as soon as we release them, they go and hide away on the underside of the leaves. You might be familiar with this behaviour if you've chased around other nice looking moth species that don't have the toxicity to protect them. They need a bit of shelter to hide away from any potential predators. So maybe we're just finding caterpillars close to this shelter because the adults are just quickly dipping out from here to lay their eggs and then coming back to where they're safe. But now that we have more of an understanding of what this moth needs, we have a better idea going around our other sites in the landscape of what they need. So we're looking for sites that have lots of their common milkworm food plant, that also are close to some scrub leaves for that bit of shelter, or maybe shading if they need that. And then hopefully we can find out which sites are suitable when we're confident we fully understand what their requirements are. So we're going to do a few more caterpillar surveys in the springs to find that out. And then we can rank our potential sites, and the ones that we think will be most suitable can receive some targeted work to make sure that they're ready to support the moths. So that is moth number 1. Moth number 2 is called the Bright Wave. You may remember this one. It was a Kent Magnificent moth species as well. But during the project, we mostly thought this moth was going to be found around the coast, because that's what the book said. It's a nice sandy colour. It would make sense if it was mostly on sand dunes. But then a population of over 1,000 individuals appeared away from the coast and not on a sand dune, in a wildflower meadow. And as soon as you walk beyond this meadow and into the next one, the moths disappear. So what was it about this particular meadow that meant they were so happy? And if we could figure that out, we can then replicate it in other areas. So we had to look to the past. And Google Earth has a handy feature where you can go back in time. So not that long ago, the field where the bright waves now have thousands was an arable field. It was then turned into a wildflower meadow, but it doesn't look particularly different to the ones around it. So what was going on here just before the moths colonised? There was a management change. So you can see there's lots of lovely little squiggly lines mown through this meadow. And that was done with the small blue in mind. There's lots of the small blue butterfly, that is. I'm sorry for mentioning a butterfly in a moth meeting. But the kidney vetch that the small blue uses didn't particularly like being grazed or completely mown. But if you create lots of edge habitat where some is mown and some areas are unmown, that encouraged the food plant. So that gives you a clue as to where the mystery lies. It's not with the adults, it's with these little caterpillars. And if you imagine you're a caterpillar and you're green, as many caterpillars are, you can camouflage quite well to the green wildflower leaves you're planning on eating. But if you're a bright wave, you're pale brown. And you can see here this caterpillar is trying to cling on to a cut stem from last year. And the fact that it's been cut means it now has to leave this stem to go off onto a surface it's not camouflaged against, to try and move around and eat more, which isn't ideal. Because if you fully cut or graze your wildflower meadow at the end of the summer, you're going to lose most of last year's stems and all of the opportunities for caterpillars like this to camouflage against them. But if you mow wiggly lines, it may be more effort, but it creates a greater diversity within your meadow. So you can see there's still wildflowers here because the meadow does get mown, but there's also lots of these nice pale stems still standing right within the food plants that we think the bright wave wants to be feeding on. And particularly the small scabious stems stay upright throughout the winter if you don't cut them down, and they seem to be perfectly camouflaged to sitting on these. And that has allowed them to spread into this area and use this area, but not the ones around it. We still need to go back and properly find the caterpillars actively feeding on plants to confirm which one they're using, but that mystery continues into next year. Our third moth species is the marshmallow moth. This is another Kent Magnificent moth species. And the mystery can't be the food plant because we know what they feed on. They're named after it. But the population sizes of the marshmallow moth, which are around the Romney Marsh area, and a smaller population along the River Medway near North Kent, they all remain quite small, even though some sites there's been lots of habitat creation work for them, and there's now about 8,000 marshmallow plants on some sites waiting for the moths to want to feed on them. But a lot of the plants are being ignored because we're only finding between 20 to 30 moths on some of the best sites. So what's going on? But most of the recording has focused on the adults. We can record whereabouts within a site the adults are and kind of guess which plants they're coming from, but we didn't know which plants specifically they were using. But we need to look at a different stage to figure that out. But how do we do that when mostly this moth is feeding on the roots? Well, there was a line in the caterpillar book that hadn't really been tested for monitoring the species before, which said if you went and looked in the spring, you could find caterpillars causing wilted leaves. But most people don't visit a marshmallow moth site in the spring because the plant only flowers from July and the moth only flies from August, so that's when people tend to go and see them. But we were having a look at the sites anyway to see if the drought was impacting the plants because it was quite bad this spring. But we found lots of wilted shoot tips, but only the shoot tip was wilted and the green leaves underneath were still quite fresh. And you could be forgiven for thinking that was an impact of the drought. But on a really big plant like this, with 26 stems, 21 of them are small and stunted and brown, and 5 of them are a lot taller and green. So that suggests there's something else going on apart from the drought. And when you have a look and peel back a couple of these stems, you find a tiny little caterpillar of a marshmallow moth. And that's my finger for scale. They're pretty small at this time of year in May. But now that we have this method, it opens up the possibilities of surveying lots of sites that aren't as accessible during the nocturnal searches at night. And it also means we can track down exact plants within a site that the moths are feeding on and figure out, is there something particular about those plants compared to all the others that are untouched as to why the moths are using them? Or is it just something simple like the females lay all of their eggs in pretty much the same location and you end up with a lot of moths in one area and not many moths in another? And the final moth mystery, you may have already heard of, but he's had a few name changes. So we'll go through the timeline. This is Periclepsis cinctana. It's quite a distinctive looking Tortrix moth, but we were a bit worried about these guys because they hadn't been seen since 1952 in England. And when something hasn't been seen for about 50 years, people tend to decide they're probably extinct. But in 1984, they turned up 500 miles to the north on the Scottish island of Tiree, which is quite a jump to make for a small moth to be found nowhere in between and just appear in Dover and on Tiree. But even the Tiree population was in trouble. After 2007, no one had seen it for a while, and in 2019, an intrepid band of explorers went up to Tiree and successfully refound them called them the Tyree Twist, and got a lot of local pride in their rare moth species as the only site for it in the UK, since it couldn't be found in Dover. There were car stickers made. I've been sent one. They're very lovely. But the mysteries remained because they were only being found in tiny fragments of habitat on Tyree, and there were repeated attempts to find the caterpillars, but we still haven't managed to find a caterpillar on Tyree to know what exactly these moths want, what they're feeding on, what their habitat is. And then I come in. Last June, I happened to be visiting the last known breeding site near to Dover, which is the lovely Lyddon Temple Ewell National Nature Reserve, managed by Kent Wildlife Trust. And it's quite expansive. There's lots of steep hills, and it happens to be the favourite spot for the straw bell moth, which we were studying the caterpillars of. So we happened to be there about 2 months earlier than we normally are to look for caterpillars rather than adults of a straw bell. And a little moth happened to flutter in front of me as we were kneeling down at eye level searching for straw bells. And I recognised it as a Tyree twist moth, or should that be the Dover twist moth? And Phil Sterling has kindly confirmed to us that in his new moth book, there's going to be a little dash, and in Scotland, everyone can call it a Tyree twist, and in England, we can call it a Dover twist. So you're now up to date with our latest moth mystery. We found a peak count of 24 of these moths at the Kent site in 2025. We've mapped out where they were found, so we're going to have targeted searches to try and find the first ever caterpillars within the UK in the spring, because we need to find out how we're going to monitor these guys, and we need to find out exactly what their caterpillars are looking for, which might be the Dyer's greenweed, these nice yellow flowers here, because it seems to be where we're finding the moths. There's a lot of flowers, but we need some evidence to back that up. So if you can get down to Dover, we'd be very happy to see you, to join in on a caterpillar hunt around April-May time. And we hope that all the answers to our moth mysteries will soon be revealed. Thank you to Natural England Species Recovery Programme and to all the members for helping to fund the moth species research work we're doing here. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had all an opportunity to grab a drink, and we will now move on with our next presentations. So I'd like to hand over to Rose Cremin from Butterfly Conservation.
Thank you. So hello from Northern Ireland. My name is Rose Cremin, and I work for Butterfly Conservation Northern Ireland in the Nature Recovery Directorate, tasked with delivering conservation for our Goal 1 species and our Goal 2 landscapes. I'm going to give you a short overview of our current work in Northern Ireland and a glimpse into our funded project planning for the coming years, which I hope you will find as exciting as we do. So firstly, while Butterfly Conservation Northern Ireland receives funding from a number of different streams, we are particularly grateful for the funding we receive from DAERA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, which supports much of our work on our shared goals. So I'm just going to give you a little short overview of how things work in Northern Ireland, which probably isn't that different to the other 3 countries. But the recording and creation of threatened lists of moth species in Northern Ireland has a long history right up to present day. Different organisations, agencies and jurisdictions work independently but collaboratively to the common purpose of mapping, better understanding and protecting threatened species. In Northern Ireland, Butterfly Conservation staff work to our organisational priorities stemming from decades of science and monitoring, with flexibility around regional priorities and where opportunities arise. So our statutory authority, NIEA, the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, maintain the Northern Ireland Priority Species List, which includes Lepidoptera. This list is important to be aware of and work with, as it is informed by data and expertise, and funded is often directed to species that are listed there. There's also the Irish Red List, a recognition of the island of Ireland as a biogeographic unit, working within the IUCN framework, identifying species at the highest threat levels. So Butterfly Conservation find working with these overlapping lists really useful and informative in helping to deliver for species in the range of different ways that we do. So Butterfly Conservation's Gold 1 species that occur in Northern Ireland are yellow-ringed carpet, scarce crimson and gold, and the Irish plume. We're actively working on 2 of these, scarce crimson and gold and Irish plume. And as mentioned previously, opportunities can also arise through partnerships or funding. And 2 other priority species we are working on include forester and chimney sweeper. Without intervention, these species will continue to decline, and there is a very real danger of extinction at the county, regional, country, or even at the UK scale. Halting and reversing the decline of threatened species therefore remains Butterfly Conservation's primary conservation objective. I'm going to talk a bit about our work for 3 of these species, scarce crimson and gold, Irish plume and forester, and I'll also touch on the projects that we are currently working on, which will enable us to deliver landscape scale nature recovery for these species. So firstly, scarce crimson and gold Parista sanguinalis. It's a micromoth with a wingspan of 16 to 18 millimeters. Its distinctive marking makes it easily recognizable, although it is a scarce species. The moths are on the wing largely in June, flying in sunshine, although they can be active at nighttime as well. Formerly, the species was found in a number of coastal sand dune sites in the north and west of England, Western Ireland, and parts of Scotland. However, it has become even more scarce and is now believed to be extinct in England and Scotland, while it continues to be found on the north coast of Northern Ireland, the Burn in the Republic of Ireland, and on the Isle of Man. So on the north coast, scarce crimson and gold is found across 3 sites, so namely McGilligan, which is managed by the MOD, which is up here if my pointer is working, the Umbra Nature Reserve, which is managed by the Ulster Wildlife, and Port Stewart Strand, which is over here, which is owned and managed by the National Trust. Species monitoring is carried out by the Ulster Wildlife at both the Umbra Nature Reserve and McGilligan. National Trust staff have also recently started monitoring the species at Port Stewart, and this has confirmed the site as a stronghold for the species. Butterfly Conservation set up a working group to bring stakeholders together to share knowledge and best practice, undertaking site visits to look at habitat condition and species surveying. We have also co-led work parties at the Umbra to manage scrub with the Ulster Wildlife, where habitat condition is under threat. In 2022, we developed 2 student master's projects, one focused on the species distribution and the second on its life cycle requirements. The species distribution project was taken up across 2 years, 2023 and 24, and the second project on the species life cycle, which is perhaps a bit more tricky, as Rebecca was discussing, looking at species requirements, but that is still available. And if anyone is interested, it does come with a small travel and subsistence budget. So the issues with scarce crimson and gold, it really is a habitat specialist. These tend to be restricted to patches of high quality, semi-natural habitat, and ecological studies of specialists have identified habitat loss, declining habitat quality due to management change, and fragmentation or isolation of remaining habitat as the 3 primary drivers of decline. So while scarce crimson and gold appears to be stable, at least at Port Stewart, the Umbra dunes are successing, with dunes becoming more vegetated. Records of the species have declined, and the availability of early successional habitat of bare sand, where its food plant wild thyme can thrive, is now a critical issue. We hope to explore a number of ways to address this with the Ulster Wildlife. Possible solutions could include the reintroduction of rabbits that were lost to the site to disease, or soft engineering works to help create the early succession habitat the species like. The site is designated, of course, so any proposals will need to be thoroughly considered and planned and balanced with other site priorities. So here we are onto the Irish plume, a real Irish specialty. So the Irish plume is a rare and local micromoth species, and in the UK is only found in Northern Ireland. There are populations in the Republic of Ireland centred around the limestone landscapes of the Burren, which is down here. I'm sure most of you would know the area. The species is small with a wingspan of 17 to 20 millimetres, and adults are on the wing in late May, potentially through to early July. It is found in limestone grassland where its food plant, mountain everlasting, occurs. The larvae feed in the stem after overwintering, which causes a distortion of the food plant. While they can be attracted to light, they are more frequently encountered during the day or early evening in favourable conditions of calm winds and warm temperatures, which is not easy, an easy ask actually on a typical Irish summer's day. So calcareous grassland itself is also a restricted habitat in Northern Ireland, like the species, and for the most part is confined to County Fermanagh, with some estimates putting the resource at just over 900 hectares, although this needs to be tested. Furthermore, within calcareous grassland habitat, the food plant is further restricted to areas where the soil is thin and rocky, which it seems to favour. So factoring in the weather and habitat conditions required to find the species, you of course also need to have the recorder available on the right day, and these don't always align, as we know. We were fortunate in June 2022 when a small party of us moth trapped and undertook a daytime survey for the species, and after a 16-year gap in records, we netted 8 individuals, and not in ideal sunny, calm conditions either, which was typical of 2022 actually. The stars did align for us on that day though, and it was a very rewarding trip. We have returned annually to target moth trap the site and sweep net again since 2022, but weather conditions were not ideal and the species has not been recorded. However, we are content that land use management on the site has not changed and that there continues to be suitable extent and quality of habitat. There are small patches of hawthorn or lone trees across the limestone hills that may need management when the food plant, etc., is mapped, and this will be considered in time. We're also interested in searching for 2 other scarce species associated with this food plant, Scrobia palpa morinella, which feeds in mines on the leaves of mountain everlasting, and Coleophora papafrella, which feeds on the seeds of the food plant. So just moving on now to the forester, which is another species I want to highlight. It's an emblematic day-flying species of damp grassland, where its food plant common sorrel or shoot sorrel grow. The species' wingspan is about 20 to 25 millimetres, and it is on the wing from late May into early July potentially. It's a fabulously iridescent species of blues and greens with its characteristic broad black clubbed antennae. The species has declined sharply across the UK in distribution, and while its food plant is not uncommon, there is some research to support the theory that it favours damp and humid conditions. In Northern Ireland, the species is now reduced to only one known breeding population, itself precarious and highly vulnerable, as it is confined to 1 to possibly 2 small open glades within the site. The glades also occur within a designated feature of bog woodland, which further limits the extent of habitat management that we can undertake. Bog woodland in Northern Ireland is also itself a very scarce resource. However, there is good news. Since 2022, Butterfly Conservation has worked with key stakeholders, including the Northern Ireland Moth Committee and the landowner and manager Northern Ireland Environment Agency, to take action to protect the species from local, if not regional, extinction. A site management plan has been discussed and produced, which we are working through with the park ranger team. We treat the site sensitively, limiting numbers on our activities, although the site is publicly accessible. Our practical conservation work parties have successfully prevented the glade from scrubbing up and being absorbed by the surrounding wet woodland. We undertake summer species monitoring while searching for other suitable patches of habitat within the site. Annual counts at the site don't always hit double digits, unfortunately, but undoubtedly, without the practical intervention we have taken on the site, it would have been lost. So in 2024, we collaborated with our partners, the National Biodiversity Data Centre in the Republic of Ireland, and their All-Ireland Pollinator Programme Plan to produce a rare pollinator guide on Forester. This guide is helping to raise awareness and provide guidance and advice to land managers and recorders alike. And it also received some media attention from the BBC, which was fantastic, especially when it was lit up on their big news screens. This work is getting members of the public looking out for the species, and we had a very promising sighting last summer from a recorder. I visited the site, which had many of the attributes we would look for, but no forester on that occasion. However, we plan to return and survey the site with the landowner this coming season, and we are very hopeful for a positive result. Given the species status, it's very important that we identify any other populations that may exist and critically ensure the habitat is managed appropriately for the long-term survival of the species in the country. So just getting onto some of the projects that we have worked on now. We were very fortunate to receive funding from the Department for Communities, which was administered by the Heritage Lottery Fund from 2022 to 2025 for an early career entrant programme, and the project we called Species on the Map. We had 2 staff employed in this project, Monty and Leah, who made valuable contributions to our mapping and planning for species and projects. So thank you to them and the funder for this. Leah, for example, had a particular focus on the North Coast and undertook some targeted surveying for Lampronia pubicornis. She trialled hand-rearing larvae and also importantly found a new breeding site at White Park Bay ASSI, also on the North Coast for the species. Through her work with the BSBI, the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland, accessing plant data, Leah was invited to produce a poster and attend the BSBI NI Recorders Meeting, displaying the fundamental link between some of our most threatened moth species on the North Coast and their food plants. So onto this very exciting project. So many of you will have heard of Peace Plus, a programme of European, UK and Irish government funding to deliver peace and prosperity to Northern Ireland and the border region. We are thrilled to have received funding from the lead partner, through the lead partner actually, RSPB, to deliver a nature recovery project on calcareous grassland, where many of our threatened butterfly and moth species occur, including small blue, again forgive the butterfly drop-in, and Irish plume. Our project will deliver across the landscapes where this habitat occurs, engaging with landowners and farmers, communities and recorders through advised species and habitat surveys, volunteer work parties, workshops and wider engagement. We are really excited about this project and all the opportunities it will bring. We will be recruiting a small team to deliver this project, which is very exciting for butterfly conservation to grow our presence in Northern Ireland. We will be sharing more about this very soon, so watch out on our socials if you want to find out more about this project or are interested in applying indeed for these roles. And I think this is my last slide. So just another great programme that has come to Northern Ireland last year, which is the Rethink Nature Partnership Programme. This will develop threatened species projects following in the footsteps of sister projects in the rest of the UK, namely Back from the Brink, Species on the Edge and Nature and Biff. Butterfly Conservation are leading or partnering on 3 moth species as well as 3 butterfly species through the project, namely chimney sweeper, scarce crimson and gold, and small egger. Chimney sweeper is an intriguing species in that its food plant, pignut, is a widespread and common plant, but the moth is scarce and restricted, a similar puzzle to the forester. In Northern Ireland, chimney sweeper is found chiefly in the west in County Tyrone, with an association with roadside verges and wet woodland tracts. We want to find out more about this species, with actions including surveying known populations and identifying new ones, increasing recording participation, providing management advice, and carrying out habitat management through our volunteer work parties. So finally, I just want to say a big thank you to our country Moth Recorder in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Moth Committee, BC branch volunteers, recorders and funders. Thank you for listening, and please get in touch if you have any comments or questions at all. And I'll now pass you over to the county and country Moth Recorder for Northern Ireland, Andrew Crory. Thank you.
Hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah.
I can see that, Andy.
Yeah, good. That's all. Even if it's only Rose is the only person listening, that's okay. I've got an audience.
Hopefully not. Bye.
So this is I was a bit late getting back to Richard with the title of this talk, so it is in there, I think, on the programme of to be confirmed. So here it is, confirmed. Things change. Notable moths from Northern Ireland in 2025. Where does the title come from? Well, basically, things always change. It's a thing you can't stop. And it was actually the guy who introduced me to moths nearly 30 years ago, Kenny Murphy. And he said that to me one day. And he just turned around to me and he says, things change, Andy. And I thought, blimey, that sums up nearly everything. You could say that those 2 words nearly sum up all of existence. So moving on from that philosophical point, yeah, my name's Andrew Crory. I'm the Northern Ireland Moth Recorder. There is no such thing as a county recorder in Northern Ireland. It's only ever been a Northern Ireland Moth Recorder. A couple of counties, if you had a county recorder, there wouldn't be very much for them to do. There's not that much in the way of records coming in for various reasons. So yeah, Northern Ireland Moth Recorder. I'm also the Nature Reserves Manager for Ulster Wildlife. But yeah, just to say that the Northern Ireland Moth Recorder role, it's an independent role, independent of butterfly conservation, set up by the Ulster Museum, part of the Northern Ireland Moth Committee, again independent, with its own terms of reference. So we sort of we're the, if you like, our role is basically just to verify and validate moth records in Northern Ireland and to, make decisions on rare moths essentially. But that's more or less as far as it goes, providing a clean data set to the right people, such as the Ulster Museum, Butterfly Conservation Northern Ireland, and Moths Ireland. So anyway, moving on. What am I going to talk about? Well, things change. So this isn't going to be very scientific at all. This is really just what's happened in the last year, really in 2025. The last time I did a talk for the National Moth Recorders Meeting was in person in Birmingham in 2013, and I thought I could do an overview, and then I thought, no, it'll take me about 4 or 5 days to cover the last, 13 years. So I thought 2025 will do, and an update of sort of things in between. So I'm just going to cover established species, so species that have arrived and if they've got a real foothold in Northern Ireland now, and they'll soon be everywhere by the looks of it. Those that have just arrived and not quite sure what they're doing yet, but probably following a similar trajectory to some other colonizing species. Newly found are species that haven't colonized. It's just we never noticed them. It's not that nobody's looked for them, but just right place, right time. And I'll show you a couple of examples of those in the last year. Uh, Advent, yeah, you can get adventive moths. If anybody doesn't know what an adventive moth is, well, if you buy a pot plant and there's a caterpillar in the soil and it's come from, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or South Africa, it's not a native species. And yeah, essentially, if you want to get some of these adaptive species, I'm sure you could buy lots of things on Amazon and they'll come in the packaging. So not moths that have got here under their own steam. And then the final category, who knows, don't have a clue. And there's actually a chance for a bit of self-indulgence in my part, but you'll see what I'm up to. So I'm looking at myself, see if I can move myself out of the way. Here's an established species, white pinion spotted. First record was 2007. You can see the map there. The maps here are courtesy of Moths Ireland, which is a brilliant website that you should visit if you're ever visiting Northern Ireland or Ireland and fancy doing a bit of mothing. Uh, it would be absolutely ridiculous if you didn't consult the Moths Ireland website and the Moths Ireland maps in particular. They're as up to date as you can get for the island of Ireland. But actually, the first Irish record from memory was at Murlough Nature Reserve, easily the greatest moth trapping site and site for butterflies and moths in Northern Ireland. You'll hear that maybe a bit more from me because I'm obsessed with the place. But yeah, I think the first Irish record was Murlough. So you can see the pattern of change there. I mean, in Northern Ireland now, those maps don't actually do it justice because it's changed even more. This moth is basically in every county. Even at a couple of sites last year, I was walking through a woodland during the day and I netted a moth and it was one of them. Mad. So it shows you how things are changing, probably a range of factors, but climate change and our changing weather patterns probably have something to do with it. But even by the looks of that map, if it first colonized in Northern Ireland in an Irish context, there's obviously been multiple immigrations into the country for the records down there further south in County Wexford and County Wicklow and places like that on the south coast. But you can see it's reached almost the entirety of Ireland. So there are quite a few species like that. Another species, I can't even remember when I actually first recorded that at one of our nature reserves, also the Wildlife Nature Reserve, brilliant site called Glenarm Nature Reserve, an Oakwood site, an SSI. In England, you have triple SIs. In Northern Ireland, we have ASSIs. For those wondering why the difference, the people in Northern Ireland who were drafting the legislation wanted it to be different. So instead of having triple SIs, they thought, let's have areas of special scientific interest. Interesting. Um, people have too much time on their hands if that's what they're getting up to, if you ask me. Anyway, first record, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And subsequently I found it the next year and the next year at Glenarm. So a species that basically, I suppose you could say it was under our noses as well, but I say established, but it's basically reached North County Antrim. So basically, you could say that it's probably in the whole of the east of Northern Ireland. And I put Vismig at Copeland Bird Observatory. Copeland Bird Observatory is an island in Belfast Lough with a it's islands in Belfast Lough, bird observatory there. No habitat for Devon carpet, but one was trapped there. So it shows that that basically visible signs of colonizing the country. I say sadly no records from Murlock National Nature Reserve. The way this moth is going, it will reach Murlock, which, as I say, is the greatest site for moth trapping in Northern Ireland. And it's very important that as many moths get onto that Murlock moth list as possible. But yeah, it's a species that I would expect to see more and more of in Northern Ireland in the coming years. Should have had a map for that one. But anyway, here's some other examples. Barred sallow feeds on beech. So beech, in an Irish context, beech is a neophyte. It's an introduced plant. Okay, it's been here several hundred years. But barred sallow was basically found by one of the moth committee members, Clive Mellon, found in his garden, which is no surprise, really, because he's recorded over 500 species of moth in his garden. To put it into context, there's around 1,500 to 1,600 species of moth in Ireland. So, he's got a third, he's recorded a third of all the Irish moths in his garden. So, when he sent me a message, oh, here we go, there we go, Clive's found another first for Ireland. Subsequently, barred sallow is found in sort of what they call the Lagan Valley, spreading throughout that area, which is essentially Belfast and the second largest city. Lisburn is essentially turned into a large conurbation between the two of them. But along that Lagan Valley, barred sallow, it's not found anywhere else yet. As compared to buff footman, first recorded in Northern Ireland in 1999 in South East County Down, now everywhere. Absolutely everywhere, sometimes occurring in the thousands. I remember Kenny Murphy, he recorded it about 10 years ago, so not that long after it arrived, 10 years in, and he had it at a site in County Tyrone. He walked towards his Robinson trap and he thought something was amiss because it looked like it was smoke coming from the moth trap. It wasn't. It was a cloud of what he estimated was 2 to 3 thousand buff footmans. So yeah, Buffman completely taken over the place. Likes to feed on lichens. You'd like to think that that's something to do with cleaner air and all that. Clifton Nonpareil. A lot of people know that this is a moth that spreads. There was first record was in Northern Ireland in 1896, and then nothing for what 126 years. When it was found in County Down. Since then, there's been about 8 examples, and yeah, it's another moth that's in the process of colonizing. The one that turned up in 2022, so the first record in 126 years, was okay. I saw it, but it was a wee bit miffed that it was on a wall 200 meters from the house, and I think I'd walked past it that morning. Anyway, Dingy Footman doing the same thing as Buff Footman, 1999. Now it's on the move. Didn't really occur for about, stayed silent, if you like, or undetected. Who knows? Or maybe it didn't colonize. But around 2018, it was recorded at Murlock. And now it can at times be the most common footman moth in the traps. Marbled white spot, same thing, 1999. Now it's everywhere. Pale tussock, started to appear in County Down. Now it's pushing northwards. Small yellow wave is doing the same thing as barred sallow moth. It was found, broadly speaking, in the Belfast area, in the Lagan Valley area. Now it's spreading westwards, out towards County Armagh, County Tyrone, and Ivy. It's spreading southwards as well. It's one of these strange ones. We always expect with climate change or the movement of these species, they'll head north, coming from the south. No, small yellow wave has decided, I'm going to go west and I'm going to go south. And good luck to it. Pamina Rita, why did I stick that in there? Only a few records away from where I first recorded it in Northern Ireland and Murlock, and it feeds on sycamore. And I get loads of them. Loads of them. Only a handful of records, but it is a moth that will, I think, just take off. And the list goes on and on and on. And that is a big, long list, and I apologise because I should have had lots of nice moth photos in there. Anyway, There's another moth. So these are the species that just arrived, hot off the press. Sycamore moth from Clive's garden. So there we go. Bard sal. I could probably do like an entire presentation just on the first records of moths for Ireland in Clive's garden. It's ridiculous. Um, so yeah, I say the Irish list is 1,600 species. So that was nice. And yeah, maybe it's a species that'll be appearing in more moth traps in Northern Ireland. Um, Another one, peacock moth. Um, there's the Irish distribution map of peacock moth there. It's a species found in the southwest in County Kerry and County Cork. Not what you would expect to turn up in County Antrim, and in fact, as far north in County Antrim as you could possibly get, suggesting probably it came from Scotland, perhaps. I made a bit of a boo-boo this one because I recorded the first sharp-angled peacock for Northern Ireland the year before. So when Jeff Campbell sent me this record, I went, "Oh yes, 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 yes. Oh, it's a sharp-angled peacock, second Northern Ireland record." Until one of my mates pointed out to me, "You need to take a closer look at that." There you go, first record for Northern Ireland, peacock moth. So again, things change. This is all about change. New arrivals. I haven't actually, now that I think about it, talked in this talk or covered in this talk, species that might be on the decline. Maybe cover that in another talk, and maybe for once I was in a good mood and I didn't want to write anything negative. Who wants to hear about the species? Let's stay in a positive frame of mind, I guess, today, because the world's mad and crazy out there. So happy thoughts. No, this makes me very happy. Calyptromorpha pallidella, first record for Northern Ireland and the third Irish record. And I recorded it at Murlock. Brilliant. The best site, as I say, for moths in Northern Ireland. 836 species of moths recorded at Murlock. Moths, because there's no such thing as a butterfly, of course. Everybody who attends this meeting knows that. A butterfly is just a type of moth, the same way as you get a Frisian cow and you get an Aberdeen Angus cow. A duck and a seagull, they're both birds. Moths, butterflies, same thing. And we shan't be hearing any more of that going forward. We probably shouldn't refer to them as butterflies anymore. Come up with a different name. So anyway, thanks to Stuart Rosell for that dissection confirmation. Stuart's been dissecting moths in Northern Ireland. One of the only people at the moment who's doing it. In fact, probably the only person who's dissecting moths in Northern Ireland. And his reward for that is that he's confirmed several new species. So and he's been a great help to us. So fair play to Stuart. Big thumbs up for him, and big thumbs up to that lovely moth because it was a nice find in the trap. Cheered me up no end. Um, Weird things just arrived as well. White point moths, first record for Northern Ireland. Funnily enough, it was at Murlock. Yeah, yeah, because Murlock, for those that don't know, is in the southeast corner of County Down. So it's basically a case of getting the first arrivals. It's a sort of first line of defence moth trap in Northern Ireland is Murlock. So I've got 5 pictures of that because on 5 separate days I had 5 separate moths. So I got the first for Northern Ireland, then the next day the second, the third, and the fourth, and so it went on. Wasn't the same moth because I took one of the moths up the road, put it in the fridge to show somebody in town. I let it out the next morning and drove to the moth trap, and there was another one, and it went on like that. But same thing happened with Radford's Flame Shoulder, new to Northern Ireland last year, and there's a run of them. But 5 records, 5 days in a row, then nothing. But probably a moth that, probably through experience, people will have experience in GB as well. I'm probably going to be looking at that being much more common moth in years to come. Another just arrived species, there was a couple of records of this, a bit of a migrant moth, Scrubapalpa solitella. Not that notable, I guess, because I'm sure people in GB get, them in gabillions sometimes in their moth trap. But nice as confirmation, new to Northern Ireland. Nice because it occurred at Murlock National Nature Reserve as well, another one for the list. And another person who's been a great help in Northern Ireland is Stephen Palmer of the UK Collected Recording Scheme. He's done several dissections, which is, basically cryptic species in there, species that, we would have just had to put down as, have no clue, no idea, let it go. Cryptic species that are important in a conservation context, but also confirmation of several species new to Ireland and Northern Ireland. So many thanks to Steve there. Really appreciate that. So that's another one that's just arrived. Bit of animation. This is weird. The only bit of an animation that appears in this slideshow, and it's a wrong spelling of the name. I spelled cocculus wrong. I actually woke up in the middle of the night about that going, blimey, I can't change that. Anyway, Cocculus flaviculana, can't pronounce that properly. Ulster Wildlife, we bought a new grassland and woodland site, species-rich grassland in County Fermanagh. Wonderful site, has things like Burnet Companion on it, Marsh Fertility. The list goes on, and we haven't even delved into knowing what's there. Guy who's interested in flies, Ryan Mitchell, really top bloke, nice guy, really knows his stuff in terms of flies. He said, "Shall I keep an eye out for any moths?" And I says, "Yeah, ping me over some pics, and sure, whatever you see, I'll identify for you because yeah, moths aren't his forte." He sent me that photograph first for Northern Ireland. It was only there half an hour. So that's a species I say is newly found in the sense it was always there. It feeds on Devil's Bit scabious. It's probably a good habitat indicator and a really, really nice shot in the arm for us because, new site and, within goodness knows how long, only a few weeks and suddenly we've got a new species in Northern Ireland and a really pretty one too. And, thanks to Ryan, fair play to him. Mostly flies is what he's into. But I'm so glad he visited the site that day. In fact, I'm not actually, because if I'd have went a week later, I probably would have found it and I would have had the first in Northern Ireland. Hmm. I maybe need to revise that slide for future presentations. Newly found as well. This species has always been here. Well, maybe not always been here because it's on small leaf lines. So another neophyte plant introduced to Ireland. This is found by Dave Ireland. Dave Ireland. Dave Allen. I'm not even going to bother pronouncing the name of that moth because I'm not going to be able to do it. Anyway, things change. How does this relate to things change? Well, Dave would only ever have been interested in macro moths. Micro scum is what he called micro moths. He had nothing to do with them until he opened up into the world of leaf mines. And blimey, I mean, he's taken to that with gusto. He's changed the map in Northern Ireland for leaf mines, found goodness knows how many species in Northern Ireland. And there's been a nice group effort because it involved, an awful lot of collaboration with the late John Langmaid and GB. And also, really, people that are, well, a couple of people that are force in nature. Andy and Melissa Banthorpe, who visited Ireland in the Burn the last couple of years as well. And you want to see the stuff they found for Ireland. Amazing. So the stuff that Dave's found and the work that Dave's done on leaf mines, and also the work that Dave's currently doing in terms of investigating DNA practices in Northern Ireland, the stuff that he's turned up. I mean, hats off to him. And I'm not just saying that because he's a very good friend of mine. But yeah, brilliant. And then a couple of weeks later, for somebody who hates micro scum, as in adult micros, he finds the first record of the first adult in Ireland. So yeah, maybe we can turn him back into a normal person because that's newly found. But then the other thing that I can't get my head around is these adventives. Yeah, yeah, interesting and all the rest of it. But Dave went to a garden centre and found that first for Ireland. Yeah, fig leaf skeletonizer. Mm, but I could probably order some plants on the internet myself and see what I get. I don't know. There's a fine line. At the same time, that's joking aside, who knows how these species are going to radiate out from places like garden centres or people's gardens. And, in the future, we may be looking at quite a different fauna, and not necessarily the one that, an awful lot of it might not be what we would recognize today. But yeah, these adventives, I don't know. Jury's out for me. Then they're down into the last few slides, which is just basically, as I say, a bit of self-indulgence for me because I can mention Murlough National Nature Reserve again and again and again. But who knows what's going on with these species? This is bloodvein. Now, I don't know what the status of bloodvein is in GB. But in Northern Ireland, it's weird. One record in 1996 from East County Down, a sand dune system called Collard. Uh, and then, it disappeared for about 16 years. And then in total, there's been, yeah, there's been 7 records over 30 years, and 6 of them are from Murlough. Weird, very weird. Don't know what's going on with that moth. More trapping required, more investigation required. Here's another one. I don't know whether I'm covering up this, but this is Agrifola latistrea. Very weird again. Murlough SAC, which includes a site called Ballykinler, which is, it's about 250 meters away from Murlough. It's the only site in Ireland. And I get this on a regular basis, or have been recently. I don't understand why nobody else is getting it, because it is very distinctive. But I'm not going to talk too much about grass moths, because usually sends most people to sleep. And here are just a range of other species. I don't know whether you can see that map, but there's one record. Oops. One record of Argyresia sorbiella in Northern Ireland. Only found that through barcoding. Who knows what that's doing now? That's 8 years ago. If that was the first one recorded in Northern Ireland, how many are out there? No idea. Caperia britannicdactylus, wood sage plume, occurs quite frequently at Merck Nature Reserve. Nowhere else in Ireland. Nowhere else. And the only conclusion we've come to is there's an awful lot of wood sage at Murlough. More so than anywhere that anybody that I've talked to has ever come across. Maybe that's it. Another one, Hypsopigia glauconalis. I'm the only person who's seen that in Ireland, and I've got it several times. It's at Murlough. Why nowhere else? So anyway, that's just a quick rundown of the state of moths in Northern Ireland, at least in 2025, probably a reflection of the state of my mind, but I don't really care. And just a big shout out here to if you are in Northern Ireland, this is where your records go. If you are using an app, you can use the iRecord app. I'm not a big fan of iNaturalist. The work that iNaturalist causes me in terms of getting records verified, I'm not allowed to use swear words, so I won't, but it's getting better. But if you're in Northern Ireland and you have records to send, the place to send them, which also is basically a hub, including iRecord, is CEDAR, Centre for Environmental Data and Recording. So that's what it's all about. It's about getting the records, getting people interested. Incidentally, somebody said to me the other day, there's been a massive upsurge in moth recording in Northern Ireland. I thought about how many active moth trappers there are who send in records. It's about 25 or 30 people. So a lot more work to be done to get more people engaged. And there's the Moths Ireland website. Like I said, if you're visiting Ireland, north or south, you'd be a fool not to consult that if you're interested in moths. And I'd just like to say thank you to a few people. Kenny Murphy, who introduced me to moth, very good friend of mine. Ted Rolston, another very good friend of mine and another mentor to me for many years and still is. The Northern Ireland Moth Committee, Dave Valentine Mellon, Ross McIlrath, CEDAR, and particular Damien McFerrin, Moss Ireland, in particular Michael O'Donnell and his brother Eamon, and another guy called Angus Tyner. Butterfly Conservation Northern Ireland, of course, which is Rose and Cremin and Rosie Irwin. Really, really helpful, really, really nice people. And Butterfly Conservation, you should do as much as you can to help these people and support them because they're brilliant. Already said Steve Palmer, and I would like to say thanks to Les Hill. And if anybody, I don't know whether Les is on the call, Les really changed the way and upped the game in how we viewed how recording and how we kept our records and just everything became an awful lot more clear as to the purpose of what we were doing and where we would go in Northern Ireland, thanks to Les. And if you are talking to him, say hello from me and Dave Allen, and also apologise to him because I've spelt his name wrong. It's Les Evans Hill. Sorry, Les. Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was brilliant, brilliant presentation, very entertaining, and you've had loads of great comments in the chat as well. There are a few questions for you, but I will move on because of the time. So I will hand over now to Abigail Lowe.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Richard. Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for taking time out of your Saturday to come and listen to these fantastic talks. Thanks, Butterfly Conservation, for inviting me to talk. So I'm Abigail Lowe. I am an interdisciplinary ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And I work within the BRC, which is the Biological Recording Centre. And I am interested in sort of interdisciplinary methods of ecology. So I'm interested in connecting people to nature and thinking about the data. So I'm not a moth expert by any means. I rely on a lot of input from others. And over the last 2 years, I've been working a lot with farmers and seeing how we can get farmers involved in monitoring. And that work has expanded now to other audiences. So farmland's a really important landscape in the UK, covers about 70% of the land and about 69% in England, which means it's really important landscape in terms of nature recovery. So we need to know exactly what's happening on farmland so that we can conserve it and improve it. But unfortunately, a lot of farmland remains under-recorded, and that's because, it's private land. A lot of recording goes on in sort of urban areas or publicly accessible areas or triple SIs and places like that. So over the last few years, particularly in Europe, there's been an increase in the interest of getting farmers involved in monitoring. And this has got a range of benefits, both to the farmers and to, the wider scientific community. And mainly it's, increasing the farmers' knowledge of the biodiversity on their land. We know that a lot of farmers see themselves as stewards of the land. They have a responsibility for the land. Involvement in recording can also encourage pro-environmental behaviour, which will have knock-on positive impacts for the environment. Farmers can get real-time data, so often if they have a consultant in, they might not see that data or for a long time. And it also, really importantly, helps to build trust between farmers, scientists, and policymakers. So if they can see, what data is going into some of these decisions, then they're more likely to, understand them and support them. And as we're all here, we're all very aware that moths are really easy to monitor in terms of practicality. And they are really good indicators of the wider health of the environment. Now, UKCH are not the first to engage farmers with monitoring moths. There's been a lot of work in the Netherlands over the last I think, since 2018 or 2019, so a long time now. They've engaged with hundreds of farmers, getting them to use moth traps and send in pictures to experts to get them to identify the moths. And then Ireland also have run a couple of trial projects on this as well, and they've had great feedback and success. Now at UKCEH, we are really interested in AI-based identification. So we wondered whether we could carry on the work that had been started out in the Netherlands. And instead of users sending in their photos to experts for identification, we wondered whether we could test the use of an AI-based identification app. So UKCEH have developed an app named eSurveyor, which was developed a few years ago, and it's mainly for farmers and landowners to monitor the habitats on their land. So we created a survey for the moth recording, and within that then is basic information they can capture around the location, the date, and then what the farmer does is takes a picture of every moth in the trap, and then the identification is provided by the AI. Now, also, a part of this is making sure that the traps are really easy to use, that they're simple, they're portable, and that they don't rely on mains, so that the farmers can, use them in many areas that are far away from their mains power. So we based our design of the moth trap on the design made by Dutch Butterfly Conservation. And these are really simple and portable traps that run off a battery pack that your phone charges off. So yeah, really straightforward. And we ran a pilot in 2024 to see how this would work, both in terms of the AI. We know there's a lot of questions around, that's probably the first question that's come up in the chat is how accurate is it? And don't worry, I'm going to cover that. But also, what do the farmers and the users get out of it? What are they motivated by? And also, how can we interpret the data and provide that back to them into something meaningful for them? We know as recorders that we're really excited by a list of moths, and we know maybe what's rare and what's not. But for beginners and new people to this field, they don't really know what a list of moths means. So how can we interpret this data and give them back something that they find valuable? So straight into the accuracy of the AI identifications. So we assess the accuracy of the AI in identifying macromoths only. We know that there's much more difficulty in identifying the micros. We did ask the farmers to take a picture of every moth in the trap, mainly as we just weren't sure whether, a size limit telling them to only take pictures of the big ones would would work. So we just thought, let's ask them to take a picture of everything and then we will assess after that. So there were just under 4,000 photos of macro moths collected in the summer of 2024. And my colleague Mark Botham, who I'm sure many of you know, went through all of those images to verify the identifications. And he either accepted them or redetermined them, or to a different species, or he classified them at a higher taxonomic rank. So of the 100% of macromoth images, we found that 82% were correct, either species or species aggregate. So those are very similar looking species that either can't be identified without dissecting them, or can't be identified, from the photo reliably. And yeah, most of those were correct to species, with a small proportion correct to species aggregate. So what about the rest then? Only 2% of these macromoth identifications were completely incorrect. So that means they were either an incorrect species within the same genus, or they were in a different genus. So only 2% were completely incorrect. 4% may have been correct. And what that means is that when Mark looked at the identification that had been provided by the app, he had to redetermine it to genus, either because, the angle wasn't at the right angle, so he couldn't necessarily tell from that photo, or, again, it's a species which is really hard to identify from a photo. So most of them went to genus, and some of them went higher than that, so family, or, maybe even higher again. And then 11% of the macromoths weren't given an identification by the AI. Now, this might seem like quite a high number, and most of these were due to the fact that there were multiple moths within the image. So whilst we asked the users to take a picture of every single moth in the trap, if you've ever done that, I have, it is quite time consuming sometimes. And so sometimes the user would end up taking photos of multiple moths in one image. Now, we are going to do some work outside of this to see whether we can train the algorithm to identify multiple moths within the same image, which would then increase the accuracy. But Mark redetermined most of these to species level, and then again, a small proportion of these to genus or higher. So when we take out the ones where the algorithm, didn't give an identification, the accuracy actually rises from 82% to 93% accuracy for macromoths, which we were, quite pleased with. So this work has now expanded sort of beyond that pilot phase in 2024, and we've had, quite a number of users, mostly farmers. The main project that we've been running at UKCH has been farmer-led. They've collected over 11,500 records across 23 Vice counties, and just from the identifications provided by the AI, we're looking at around probably 500 species, which is really exciting. And you can see some of the spread there across the UK. So I'll delve in a little bit more to each of the projects and how they've come about and what they've found. So as I mentioned, this work really was a pilot funded by DEFRA in the summer of 2024, where I engaged with a small number of farmers, mainly in the Chilterns. And this was a data set that the accuracy sort of analysis is based on. And the farmers were really engaged with the moth monitoring as part of this work. We had quite a few notable records. We've got the scarce forester there, which is one of very few moths, I think, that Mark hasn't seen. So it was quite nice for him to verify that one. And then from the pilot, as I said, I do a lot of different methods to work with people, including some social science. So I did some questionnaires which, tried to get a little bit more feedback on how the farmers found things. And the majority of farmers really enjoyed it. These are people who never would have gone out and bought a moth trap. They thought that moths were, a couple of species, small and brown, and that they ate your clothes. So it was really really rewarding to see some of the feedback that we got from farmers. We had an optional WhatsApp group that farmers could join, and they were sending in their pictures saying, "Oh, I've seen this one this morning." When they had some little difficulties with the traps, they were problem solving between them, and yeah, had some really nice anecdotes from that work. And then last year, I've also been engaging with some more farmers as part of a bigger project called Transform, which is all about engaging farmers with monitoring biodiversity on their farm in terms of thinking about new crop rotations that'll be resilient in the face of climate change. And again, these farmers had not really considered moth monitoring before. They were really excited by what they were finding. And then there's the work that has happened in Pembrokeshire, which is one of my favourite things to talk about, to be honest. So this work just kind of took off by chance. Claire Flynn, who's a project officer at the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park. I've known Claire for quite a few years now, and she'd read about eSurveyor and the work that we were doing with farmers. And she reached out to me and thought, hey, this is great. I'm also working with landowners around Pembrokeshire Coast National Park on monitoring biodiversity and, putting in interventions to support biodiversity. Can we use eSurveyor to engage the landowners? So we thought, yeah, why not go for it? This is a great sort of test to see how it can be used in different settings. And it's had really, really great feedback. Claire was giving out traps to landowners. I think they were having them for a month and then they were swapping over. But she was having difficulties getting the traps from people to pass them on. There's stories of landowners engaging with their neighbours and showing them how to use the traps. That one landowner even held a Moths, Meadows and Barbecue event, which Claire spoke at. And yeah, lots of people have been engaged and it's been absolutely brilliant. And together they've collected over 3,500 records, which I haven't given the full data summary to Claire and the Pembrokeshire team just yet. But that'll be really exciting to go through some of that soon. And this has been possible really through collaboration with the County Moth Recorder, Paul Warren, who I'm pretty sure is on this call. So thank you very much to Paul for going through all of those records and verifying them on the eSurveyor platform. That's been, yeah, brilliant to have that engagement because, as I said, this wasn't a project funded by UKCH, and we wanted to make sure that that data was verified and usable. So yeah, it's been a really brilliant example of how this work can be carried out sort of in practice. Now, we really wanted to improve the moth trap design that we used in the 2024 pilot. As I said, that was based on a design by Dutch Butterfly Conservation. It was quite simple, but there were some elements of it which were pretty costly. The cutting out of the different sheets of plastic for the vanes and the rain guard was quite labour intensive, and there were some other tricky things with the light sensor and the battery pack with the electronics that we needed to make a little bit more robust. So last winter, we set off on improving this moth trap design with the aim of making it simpler, more robust and cheaper so that we can use it to scale up moth monitoring. So the design is two vanes which fit together at 90 degrees. They're made of acrylic. And then the rain guard slots on top with a central plastic tubing in the middle with an LED strip wound around it. And the LED strip is attached to a USB and also a light sensor within that, which can be plugged directly into the battery pack. And then there's a very thin polypropylene funnel, which is just a sheet that then can be folded to make the funnel. And this means that all of these elements can be flat packed, which makes it a lot easier for transporting. And you just need the bucket then. So what I want to make really clear from this talk is that our goal at UKCH is, of course, not to make a moth trap which replaces all moth traps. I know there'll be questions about how many moths it catches. It doesn't catch as many moths as Robinson trap, but we have done some field trials last summer to compare it to the actinic traps. So we're looking forward to sharing that soon. So they've been validated. We also didn't want to overwhelm farmers with having, hundreds of moths in the trap. Again, this is supposed to be beginner friendly, making it just kind of that stepping stone really to beyond the beginner approach. I also want to make clear that AI does not sort of replace recorders and verifiers and field guides. I'm a recorder myself. I know how important these skills are for identification, but this kind of audience, a lot of them, as I said, they would never have gone out to buy a moth trap. And there's been some nice examples where I've been able to connect county moth recorders with the moth recorders, and it just expands that community of people really, and getting people engaged with moth trapping in a way which excites them, and then hopefully they learn more and they want to go off and learn about the micromoths, which we know the AI is not quite there yet, and even from photos we know a lot of experts will struggle with the micros. So yeah, that is our goal at UKCH, and we just, are really, really excited about getting more people involved in moth monitoring. And we want to make sure that the data is of quality and that it goes to the right places so that it can be used in future research. So that, brings me on to the question of what happens to the data. So at the moment, the data does sit within the eSurvey platform, which, if you know iRecord well, is built in Indicia. So it's the same sort of back end as iRecord, which means that we can transfer it through to iRecord. Would be quite straightforward. There's a reason that we haven't done that so far. And that's because we don't want to flood the iRecord system with a load of photos from, lots of new users. We don't want to, overload the verifiers, so we know spend a lot of time going through the iRecord data and might not want to engage with AI, identified images. That's completely fair enough. And that's why we're working with Butterfly Conservation and hopefully some county moth recorders in the coming weeks to think about how we can integrate the data into the iRecord platform, possibly as a separate tab, similar to the iNaturalist data, so that verifiers can choose to engage with it or they can leave it alone. It's completely up to them. And, those questions about what data must we ensure that we're capturing in eSurveyor, that will make the data more worthwhile and usable for future purposes. So, we're really glad that Butterfly Conservation have supported this work, and we're really excited about the future. So, the future is really exciting. We've got an improved trap, which is robust. It's really easy to put together. We've tested it in the field. It's great for beginners. I really see an opportunity to link moth recorders and farmers. We know that the county moth recorders information is available on the BC website, but farmers have no clue really how to connect with county recorders, and a lot of them want to engage with them. So yeah, I think we can help to bridge that gap really. And I also know that there's recorders who would love to have farmland near them that they can record on, different habitat, different areas. So hopefully that's something that we can think about in the near future. As I said, we are very mindful of data mobilization. As I said, I work at the BRC, making sure that the data is open and usable is absolutely, fundamental to what we do. And the goal really is to turn recording into sort of structured monitoring and evaluation. That's the aim, and that can be done with these traps. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and thanks to all the participants and my colleagues for their support. Mark has been teaching me so much about moths that I didn't know, which has been brilliant. And yeah, thanks again.
Great, thank you very much, Abigail. That was fascinating. And as we know, the farming community is such an important community to engage with, and it's great to see how much engagement that you've had from that, and great to hear about the plan with the data as well. You've received lots of questions and comments, so I'll let you have a look through those. We're going to take a break now, and if you could all come back at 12:15 for our next presentation, please. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're now ready for our third session of the morning's meeting, and I'm now going to hand over to Emilie Ellis for our next presentation, please.
Yeah, so thank you all for being here and inviting me to talk. I'm an ecologist looking at the human drivers of how that affects moth communities. And specifically, I'll talk to you today about my PhD work about urbanisation and the impacts it has on moths and other pollinators. So I suppose I wanted to give a slight overview about why I'm here, or how you managed to look at moths as your career. At the beginning of my moth journey, I was first introduced to moths as an undergraduate. So I've been studying moths for about 9 years now. And I became quite obsessed quite quickly when I saw my first moth trap and was exposed to the fact that they're not just dull, boring things. So I decided to spend the year before my thesis collecting moths in Dublin gardens in my thesis for my undergrad, looking at how garden practices influence moth communities. So then I suppose it was somewhat lucky that a PhD on urban pollinators came up just when I was finishing my undergraduate degree. So when I applied and managed to get the position, I made sure that urban pollinators also included moths. And this turns out to be one of the most exciting parts of my research, in my opinion anyway. But this kind of 4-year research endeavour is what I'll be talking about in this presentation. But since 2023, I've actually been working at the University of Helsinki as a researcher. And instead of going out and collecting moths in the field, which I miss quite a bit, I'm actually using data like the Finnish version of the UK Moth Recorder scheme. And I'm uncovering how climate change is driving the extinction of cold-adapted species and colonization of warm-adapted species. And this data set has over 1 million moth records. So it's an example of how important all the light traps that you guys are processing and all the data you're generating. Not only are you volunteers and every volunteer moth recorder the reason why I have a salary, but more importantly, it allows us to uncover what these long-term influences of humans are doing to change moth communities, and what this means for predicting and quantifying how our ecosystems will continue to function in the future. So I'm not going to be talking about that right now, but I'm happy to send some papers of the stuff I'm working on at the moment into the chat. So what I'm going to talk about today is that my research in UK cities, what my research in UK cities revealed about how moths respond to pollination, how moths respond to urbanisation, and what this kind of means for potentially conserving moths. So why should we study moths? I think this is pretty much covered by everyone else's talks. And I think Julie's introduction was much more eloquent than what I'm going to say. But basically, it's nice to be in a room of people, or like online, where we've got over 300 participants that don't consider moths as a dull pest that eat your clothes. So, I mean, when you talk to a normal person, this public perception of moths still holds. And like even some ecologists I work with, they still think they're nasty things that fly in your face at night. However, just to reiterate, not only are they beautiful and very cool, they're also essential for our ecosystem functions. So this is true for both their main life cycle stages. So for example, as caterpillars, they might eat some of your veggies in your gardens, but their herbivory is essential to plant regulation. Lots of caterpillars and larvae eat organic material, making our soils fertile and rich. And then I suppose one of the best examples and why we try to for grant proposals, say why moths are important is because the more charismatic species like birds, these caterpillars are essential for their food resources. So for example, a blue tit, if it has 5 chicks in a nest, they could be foraging up to 500 caterpillars every day. So adult stage is kind of what I'm looking at. Mostly, as you know, they're easier to sample with light traps rather than trying to figure out where they are in the understory or vegetation. But as adults, they're really important pollinators. And this is becoming more apparent now. But as adults, they need nectar a lot of adults need nectar for energy. So they inherently visit a flower and collect some pollen by mistake as they're foraging for that sugary resource. And then they transfer pollen to another flower. So that means that that flower has now been pollinated. Because moths are active at night, I suppose it's only recently, as new technologies emerge, that we can actually quantify nighttime pollination. So what we've found is that they're not only efficient pollinators, they're overlooked but also extremely undervalued. And as you can go out in the day and look at a bee visiting a flower, it isn't unsurprising that bee pollination and to a lesser extent flies are dominating the literature of insect pollinators. And that's kind of what my research tries to address. The worrying thing is that these are massively undervalued in all their ecosystem roles because they're overlooked, but they're declining quite rapidly and quite substantially. So this means that these declines threaten multiple ecosystem functions. And what we know is that these declines, as usual, are dominated by human-driven land use homogenization. And this is through large-scale intensive agriculture, but also urbanization. And also not mentioned here is climate change, like my recent research. But what I want to say is that it's a vital time to understand how to protect moths and to kind of use that same, or get that same momentum that's prevalent in the kind of Save Our Bees campaign. But what we need to do is understand how we can conserve moths. So this brings us to moths in urban areas. So this is all my PhD research I'll be talking about now. So compared to vast expanses of agriculture monocultures, urban areas are actually quite complex. So this is because they're not only areas of ecologically useless impervious surfaces, which is defined here as like buildings and roads, they're also interwoven with green spaces. So when we consider the life cycle of moths, city-dwelling moths are searching these green spaces for host plants to lay their eggs and also enough plant material for caterpillars to feed on. And then as adults, they're also searching for flowers for nectar, for energy, so they can kind of reproduce and continue this cycle. Then we also compare these kind of resource requirements with bees. They're also searching these green spaces that can sustain their life cycle, but I would argue they're slightly more simple as they use mainly flower resources. So they forage pollen to provision their library, and as adults, they also feed on pollen and nectar. And then we can also look at hoverflies, and like moths, they need non-floral resources to complete their life cycles. So their larvae are like predators of insects like aphids, and they can also need sometimes stagnant water or plant material as herbivores. So hoverflies, bees, and moths are all searching these green spaces for different resources. And as a result, we could hypothesize that urbanization, i.e. the increasing area of impervious surfaces, should affect each insect group differently. And this is what the first chapter of my PhD set out to answer. How do diverse pollinator groups respond to increasing urbanization? With the idea that as you go towards the city centre and more urban areas, the resource availability decreases. So how did I do this? So all my research was conducted in allotments. I would like to say there was a big fancy argument for this, but it's mostly because they were easy to access and they're distributed throughout UK cities quite substantially. So in Leeds, Sheffield and Leicester, I chose 8 allotment sites that were radiating out from the city centre. So you can see this map of Leeds, for example. The orange dots show the allotment locations, and you can see that we've got sites in the city centre and they're going out towards the suburbs. Allotments might be super diverse green spaces, but they're also embedded in the surrounding matrix of other green and impervious surfaces. So I quantified the green space types and the area of impervious surfaces surrounding each site at a 1 kilometre buffer. So you can see, like in the city centre there, it's super grey, and then in the outskirts, it's quite green. And then, although it feels like ages ago, and it was ages ago, I did this field work in 2019, and it was only just published in summer last year. And this just highlights the tedious journey of collecting insects into a published piece of work. But in each allotment site, I collected diurnal insects, hoverflies and bees, using sweep nets and malaise traps, and then light traps for moths. And this was monthly from the growing season from March to October. And then what we found was that, well, what we wanted to look at is how urbanization affects the species richness of communities. And I want to explain the plots before I show the data. So for example, here in Leeds, each orange site is compiled the total species richness of moths, bees, and hoverflies over the summer of sampling. And the horizontal axis is the area of impervious surfaces. So on the left, it's more green, and the right, it's more urban. And we want to see how species richness of these 3 groups responds to this urbanization. And what I found was, despite all insects needing different resources, all insect groups declined with urbanization. These parallel lines basically highlight the fact that there is no species-specific response to it. They're all just declining in the same way. And despite all 3 cities of Leeds, Leicester, and Sheffield, and like Sheffield's a pretty green city, I would say, all of these effects were similar across 3 cities, highlighting the kind of total impact of how impervious surfaces influence these insect groups. Now, I wanted to see different responses in different insect groups, right? So the only natural thing was to look at green spaces. So different types of green spaces are managed differently, like parks are different to allotments, to gardens, to trees, to semi-natural areas. So what I quantified in these areas surrounding the allotments was tree canopy and semi-natural habitat. And when we look at semi-natural habitat too, despite all these pollinator groups needing different resources, they're all responding positively to increasing areas of semi-natural habitat within these green spaces. However, when you look at tree canopy, you can see that these lines aren't parallel, and the dashed lines are of hoverflies and bees. They weren't statistically significant, but they're also flatlining, right? So you can see that moth communities could be utilizing trees more than bees and hoverflies. And there's various reasons of why this could be. They could be providing like daytime roosting habitats or caterpillar food resources, but the one I wanted to test was, could they be providing primary adult nectar resources? So this brings me to the second chapter of my PhD, where I ask, what do bees and moths forage on? So despite different life cycles, both adult bees and moths visit flowers. The moths are pretty generalist, just looking for sugar in the nectar, whereas bees need both pollen and nectar. So there might be differences, is what I said. But could their feeding preferences uncover why that moths and bees are responding differently to different green spaces? So the question is, do moths and bees forage on the same flowers? And what I did was only look at Leeds, because this was quite a more specific project, so we didn't have the capacity to do all 3 cities. And we looked at the foraging preferences of moths and bees along an urbanization gradient in allotments again. But how do you observe nocturnal visitation? This is what I proposed was a limitation in the fact that we're only starting to look at moth pollination now. So what we do, or what I did, was that you look at the pollen on their proboscis. So as they feed for nectar, they inherently gather pollen on their tongues or mouthpieces. So what you do is take the pollen off these mouthpieces and sequence and identify the pollen of the plant that they're visiting based on the plant DNA. And what you can do here is start doing a kind of network approach, is what we call it. But it's quite simple, though it might look complicated when you see the full results in the end. But I just want to say, so you basically have one moth species and you've got the plants that it's visited. And then you can add another one and you can start seeing what they visit and the overlap. And then you can have a whole moth community and their plant communities that they visit. And then you can add in the bees and see if there's differences in what they're visiting and what the overlaps are. So the results were basically this massive network where you've got the orange nodes on top for the moths, and you've also got the blue nodes on top for the bees, and then the plants are at the bottom. And all these lines are what they're interacting with. So just as an overview, we're seeing that moths are visiting a diversity of plants way more than we thought they would be. There's an overlap of 17% of the plant community, but also moths are visiting almost over a third of plants that bees aren't visiting, and bees are visiting slightly more species. But it's pretty impressive how many species of plant that we found moths visiting. So what this means for the patterns of moths and bee community along an urbanization gradient is this overlap of plants could be the reason why we're seeing similar responses to semi-natural areas that I showed you earlier. So these areas could have flowers that both bees and moths like to use for food as adults. And then when we look at the moth-specific plant communities, moths were actually mostly preferring woody plants and including like trees and shrub flowers compared to bees. And this was quite exciting because this demonstrates that moths are utilizing urban trees. And if we link this back to the reason why moths are increasing with area of tree cover, this could be one of the reasons why, that adult moths are using trees in urban areas for food resources more than bees. And unfortunately, we didn't have the capacity to look at hoverflies too on this, but I can imagine there's an overlap and a specific plant community they're also visiting too. So this network approach allowed the kind of preferences of different pollinator groups to be highlighted, and it showed the positive responses for green spaces because of their resource usage. However, the other fundamental question is, why are pollinators declining with urbanization? And how can this network approach tell us more? So if you remember in Leeds, I collected these samples along an urbanization gradient. So what I did, or what I could do, is that I could look at the total number of plant species that each moth and bee community were visiting at each site. And then like the graph you can see here, instead of having the insect species richness along this urbanization gradient, I could do how many plant species are each group foraging on along an urbanization gradient. So that's what I did. And although I haven't really talked about the different times of summer that I did this analysis on, you can see that despite having different flower preferences as urbanization increases, so this kind of, the horizontal line at the bottom is increasing area of impervious surfaces, we can see a decline in the pollen species richness. So the number of plants that bees and moths are visiting decreases as you go towards the city centre. And this was true across all the seasons, or throughout the season, so from early summer to late summer. So in more simple terms, in less urban sites on the left here, you've got this nice network and the plants are available. So you've got more species of moths and more species of bee. But as you go towards the more urban areas, you're losing this plant diversity. And as a result, the food sources for different insects are not there for them. So as a result, we can see these declines in insect species richness due to the fact that resources are limited as we go along an urbanization gradient. And this is just kind of the kind of conceptual figure here that you see. So resource availability declines as you go along an urbanization gradient. So I'd also like to say that right now I've neglected the larval stages in all of this research, and I will continue to, but I will now talk about what this potentially means and what we can do to understand what's really going on here and what my conservation ideas are. So conserving moths in urban areas is basically we want to try and stop this decrease in resource availability, right? And like at the moment, these kind of bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches of doing bee bombs and planting flower patches for bees is potentially increasing bee communities in urban areas. And it's been shown in some research that bees are more robust to urban areas than other insect groups, even though my research didn't show that necessarily. But the idea is just to increase the resource availability for the diversity of pollinators in urban green spaces. So for moths, what my research suggests, and some other research, is that urban trees and woody vegetation for moths should be incorporated into pollinator conservation practices. So you can see here my nice infographic of help save the bees and the moths. And this kind of correlates with some ideas in urban areas. So they're planting trees to try and reduce the heat and like the urban heat island effect. So it could just be like this nice natural progression that if we can say that in conservation areas and urban areas, planting trees can help humans and better city living, it could also like concurrently help moth communities. And something kind of maybe more realistic, because I can't imagine that like city councils are going to be super excited about moths because they don't know how nice they are. But we can look at the overlap. So when we dig deeper into the plants that both moths and bees were visiting, we found that they were primarily visiting wild plants. And remember, this is sampled in allotments. So allotments are mainly like in like non-native flowers and crops. So despite all this high plant diversity of gardening, they were visiting these like nice grassland wildflowers. So this goes to this idea of less mowing, less enriched and more wild. So this could be a very easy conservation measure to increase the food resources for bees and moths in cities, especially moths, because I think bees are okay. So as I mentioned there, I only focus on the adult processes, but really if we're to effectively conserve our diverse insect pollinators, we need to quantify, study and understand the resource requirements throughout their life cycle. And this needs to be done sooner rather than later in light of the declines of insects and moths and bees and hoverflies, though I think it's a safe bet to assume that most biodiverse green spaces are more likely to provide these resources, even if we don't have the research yet. And as you know, it took, 6 years for me to publish a paper from collecting. Like the idea of just having not a lawn, but not just a flower patch, but also having somewhere for a refuge for daytime roosting moths and some stagnant water for, well, the urban amphibians, but also for hoverflies laying their eggs. It's just kind of simple idea that increasing the how your green space looks like in terms of habitat quality, it's likely to correlate with increasing resource availability. And yeah, so that's basically my big message after a few years of work. Easy. Thank you for listening, and put some questions and comments into the chat if you like, and I'm happy to answer them. And I can put some of the papers, they're all open access, so I'll send them into the group as well if you want to read more. Yeah, and thank you again.
That was fascinating research, some sobering data going through there, but also kind of emphasising the importance of our work that we can try and influence city councils across the country. There are some questions for you in the Q&A and I think some comments in the chat as well. But we will now move on to our final presentation. So let me hand over to Tim Blackburn, please.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be here this morning and to hear all these inspiring and very professional talks from people who really know their stuff about moths. And so last and very much least is me. I feel a bit of an imposter here, as when it comes to moths, I'm really no more than an enthusiastic amateur that's stumbled on this wonderful world rather late in life. But on the plus side, this is the last talk, so you can always duck out early and get an early lunch. And I direct that especially to those people who I know will have seen this talk before. So I'm an ecologist, a scientist, and as such, what I have attempted to do with my career is to try and understand essentially ecological systems. So ecology is the scientific study of the processes that determine the abundance and distribution of organisms. Or another way of looking at that is, why do species live where they do, in the numbers that they do? Now, I think when it comes to science, it's physicists that get all the credit for their understanding of the universe, but really physicists have it very easy. If you think about physics, what are there? There are 4 fundamental forces, 17 elemental particles, 100 odd elements. These are, really simple systems compared to ecological systems. So when we think about ecological systems, we often start by thinking about, the species that those systems comprise of. So we know about 1.5 million named species, but of course, actually, that's only a small fraction of the species that we think we share the planet with. Most species we don't know about yet. We reckon there's probably somewhere in the range of 3 to 100 million eukaryotic species on the planet, maybe sort of realistically about 8 million. So when you compare those sorts of things to the numbers that physicists are dealing with for their elemental particles, it's really different orders of magnitude. And every one of those species is different, doing a different thing on the planet. And that's eukaryotes. When it comes to sort of bacteria and the like, we don't even have the first clue as to how many species there are. Estimates vary from sort of 10,000 to 1 trillion. So really, most of the world is unknown. But of course, that's just the species. Those species are made up of individuals, and individuals are, incredibly large in number. So for most groups, we don't even have the first clue how many individuals there might be. For birds, we have some probably the best estimate, so maybe 160 odd million British breeding birds. Worldwide, maybe 83 billion birds on the planet. So that's only around 10 birds for each person, which always seems far too few for me. And then it comes to things like insects. So, how many insects are there? You can go online and you can find, I think, on the Smithsonian website, an estimate of 10 quintillion insects, or maybe 100 million insects for each breeding bird. But it doesn't even tell you what they mean by an insect. Is that adults? Does it include developmental stages? There's no clue. I think they just plucked that number out of the air. And then when you come to the even smaller things, maybe 1 billion bacteria for every gram of soil. And then viruses, maybe estimates of like 10 nonillion viruses, or 1 billion viruses for every insect on the planet, which, if you line them up, would end to end would cover 100 million light years. I think quite a few of those viruses have been inhabiting me over the last week. So apologies for being a bit croaky. But of course, all of those individuals, many of which will be different as well, they don't exist in isolation, they interact. And there's far more possible communities of coexisting species than there are atoms in the known universe. And of course, every second, all of these systems change. Individuals are born, and they die, and they move. And we have to try and understand all of these, these various interactions and movements and births and deaths and so on, to understand ecological systems. So ecology is just incredibly complicated. So in understanding ecological systems, where do we even begin? Well, one place that we can begin, which will be familiar to all of us here, is a moth trap. So the contents of a moth trap is a sample of biodiversity. It's a sample of an ecological system. And thinking about a moth trap can help us maybe to think about how ecological systems work. And moths are actually a really good group to do this with, because around about 1 in 10 of all the named species that we know of is a moth. So somewhere in the region of 140,000 species. So if we can understand moth communities, moth biodiversity, moth ecology, then we're sort of taking a big step to understanding the ecology of ecological systems more widely. So, and for ecologists, we also tend to think about systems by starting out by thinking about populations. So these are groups of organisms, all of the same species, living in some defined area in some period of time. And the thing with populations is that populations can grow. And in fact, this is one of the key things that life does that nothing else does. So, at its simplest, for things like bacteria, populations can grow because cells will split into two. And where you had one cell in the past, you had two now. And in the future, you can have 4 or 8 or whatever. And just to show you what a sort of a powerful force reproduction is, we can sort of look at the example of this moth, which actually came from the first moth trap I ever ran myself here in London. It's a rather tatty individual, but those of you who know will know that this is a gypsy moth. And gypsy moths are really a fantastic illustration of the powers of populations to grow, which is where sort of ecological systems start out. And the reason why gypsy moths are such a great example is down to this man. So this is Leopold Trouvelot. He was a French scientist working in the States. And one of the things he was interested in was whether you could actually use gypsy moths to produce silk, silk being a very valuable commodity. So Trouvelot, he imported some gypsy moths from Europe into the States and had them in his house in Medford in Massachusetts, which is this house here. And then in some time in the sort of late 1860s, we're not exactly sure when, there was an accident and some of the moths got blown out of the window of his house and into the surrounding environment. He realized that this might be a problem, but for many years, nothing really much was observed. He actually moved house and sort of left the area. And then about 20 years after those gypsy moths escaped, the people of Medford really started to notice that there were rather a lot of these insects in their town. And we have sort of first-hand sort of evidence of this from interviews with the townspeople. So like Mrs. Follensby, for example, the walks, trees and fences in my yard and the sides of the house were covered in caterpillars. She used to sweep them off with a broom and burn them with kerosene, but very quickly they'd be as many as ever. None of the trees in her garden had any leaves. One of her neighbours, Mrs. Snowdon, I've seen the end of Mrs. Spinney's house so black with caterpillars that you could hardly have told what colour the paint was. And Mrs. Ransom, in the evening we could hear the caterpillars eating in the trees. It sounded like the clipping of scissors. So the ability of the gypsy moth population to grow basically turned the town of Medford into a wasteland. The state of Massachusetts tried to deal with this problem. Here we see some workers trying to strip trees of gypsy moth eggs, but it was too late, of course, by that point. The worms were out of the can. And this moth now occupies more than 1 million square kilometres of northeast North America. And in some years, they have outbreaks where they can defoliate millions of hectares of forest. Just shows the power of species or the power of populations to grow. And this is really life's superpower. But the thing is, of course, we're not anywhere knee-deep in any one species. Even in Massachusetts, they're not knee-deep in gypsy moths, and outbreaks don't happen every year. And of course, the reason is that populations are constrained by various other forces. So all populations sort of need food to grow, like the gypsy moth or like this dingy footman, whose population in the UK has expanded greatly over the last few decades with the Clean Air Act and the spread of lichen. But food is a limiting resource, and it's also even more limiting when you have more than one species that tries to eat it. So species will compete for resources, and that will limit their population growth. So here we have a couple of classic sort of moths that were part of a classic study on competition. The green tortrix and the winter moth here, the caterpillars both feed on oak. You'd think that this would be a fairly unlimited resource, but even in sort of typical years, these two moths can strip about 40% of the leaves off an oak tree, and in some years they will completely defoliate them. And in fact, it's been estimated that trees would put on about 60% more wood in any given year if it wasn't for these moths. But the point is that, these moths competing for the same resource will impact on each other's populations and prevent them from growing. As it happens, in this case, studies suggest that the winter moth is a superior competitor and would outcompete the tortrix, which does then raise the question of how the tortrix continues to persist in the face of this competitive effect. But that's something that we will come back to in a little while. Another reason why populations don't go out of control is that populations are food for other populations. And in terms of moths, it seems that often everything is out to get them. So if you run a moth trap, you'll know that as well as attracting moths, you'll attract predators of moths. You'll attract wasps, you'll attract birds, you'll attract parasitoids as well. So this is an Enicospilus inflexosus. It's a specialist parasitoid of the oak egger that we just saw. And there's probably, it's estimated, one specialist parasitoid species for every other insect species on the planet, which would make an extremely underrecorded group. But as Emilie mentioned in her talk, yes, things consume moths, but that's great for the biosphere in general, because that means that, moths contribute to food chains, and that means that we have populations of the lovely garden birds that we all love, the greats and the blue tits that will consume in the UK across the whole population, maybe a couple of billion caterpillars every day. And these species breed better and do better in years when moth numbers are higher. So moths are fantastic at turning plant into animal, and then other animals are fantastic at turning moths into their biomass. Of course, populations grow, but populations don't exist in isolation. And one of the most interesting questions in ecology is, why we see species living together in communities. And I think this is particularly interesting for moths, where sort of many of the species seem to be essentially identical and doing identical things. So examples like the uncertain here and the rustic, which even to a sort of a trained mother can be quite difficult to separate without delving into their internal parts. What we tend to think is that, species, they consume different things, they have different predators, they have different environmental conditions that they like. And that means that, given that the environment varies, there'll be certain points across the environmental gradient where those species like to live. And the fact that these species sort of live in sort of overlapping, or some of these species overlap in terms of their preferences, means that they sort of are lumped together in communities. So it's kind of a bit like Alexander's hymn, "The rich man in his castle and the poor man in his gate." So species have their niches, and that's how we get them coexisting in communities. But really, that doesn't explain to us why we can have species like the uncertain and the rustic sort of living together doing essentially the same thing. And increasingly, we think that there's much more of a stochastic element to the structure of communities. So when an individual dies in a community, it can essentially be replaced either by a birth within the community or immigration from outside the community. And it's the fact that ecological communities exist in a wider landscape that allows species that have similar niches to be able to coexist through these stochastic processes of birth, death, and immigration. Now, what that means, of course, is that then movement really matters. So if communities depend on what's going on in the wider landscape, the movement between sort of within and across communities really matters. Now, migrants is one of migration is one of the phenomena that makes moth trapping so exciting, because particularly at certain times of year, you never really know what you're going to get. But for an ecologist, sort of migration means any sort of movement. I mean, I guess the poster child for migration in terms of moths is the silver Y. It's a species that can travel large distances at speed, several hundred kilometers in a night. Millions of them probably cross the channel every year. But the point is that, this is perhaps an extreme example of migration in a moth. But movement matters for all individuals of all species. Everything has to move. It's an essential, not a luxury, and that movement allows ecological systems to maintain and add to their diversity. So individuals sort of moving between different sort of subpopulations can allow populations to persist in a landscape. If a local population goes extinct, as will often happen with cinnabar moths when their ragwort plants disappear, they can then maintain in the environment because individuals can colonize other patches. So they move between patches and that maintains them. And similarly, the movement between sort of mainlands and islands means that islands like the UK have diversity where they wouldn't have diversity before. So movement, across communities is really important. But of course, if you're thinking about what goes on in the wider landscape is really important for maintaining ecological systems, then you have to think about, what it is that determines how many species there are in the wider landscape. So you're sort of moving from thinking about the births and deaths of individuals up to the births and deaths of species. And moths sort of can help us here as well. So most of our knowledge on speciation and extinction comes from charismatic megafauna, so mammals and birds. But I think there are certain moths, the hawk moths in particular, that rank as sort of honorary megafauna. And so, for hawk moths, we can look at the diversity across the old world and see where there are lots of species and where there are few species. And from that, we can start to understand, what it is that determines why some areas have more species in general than others. It turns out that for moths, there's a big effect of primary productivity on how many species there are. And so in the UK, for example, where primary productivity generally is not that high, we've probably got maybe sort of 18 species, I think, recorded in the UK. But there are sort of 100 kilometre squares in Southeast Asia down here where you can have 10 times that many species. And diversification varies not only through space, but also through time. And we can sort of study moth phylogenies to start to understand what it is that has driven the diversification of moths since they first appeared in the fossil record a couple of 100 million years ago. And we see some interesting things. So, the first division in the moth family tree is between the Microterigidae, I can never pronounce it, Microterigidae, and all other species. So, the Microterigidae and all other moths have been diversifying for the same amount of time, but there are 1,000 times more species in the group that is not Microterigidae, and that's probably because of the evolution of the proboscis, which has allowed the moths largely, or proboscis-bearing moths, to diversify in tandem with flowering plants. There's also a sort of a nice, interesting sort of diversification event here in the noctuids. Many of them, the moths that we catch in our traps, are noctuids, and the reason for that is probably because in the Eocene, a drying of the environment led to an expansion in the temperate latitudes of herbaceous plants as forests thinned out, and many of the noctuids have colonized the temperate regions of specializing on these herbaceous plants, and that is probably why we have so many noctuids in the UK. So there's a variety of processes that naturally determine the abundance and distribution, the diversity of organisms that explain why sort of in the natural world we have the sorts of species that we catch in our moth trap in the numbers that we do. But of course, increasingly the study of ecology has gone from the study of natural processes to the study of what humans do. So humans are driving species extinct like the stout dart. They're introducing species adventives like the box tree moth, and they are changing the structure and dynamics of moth populations, causing populations to decline, showing the graph that Emilie showed earlier. Even affecting the diversification and the sort of occurrence of new moth species. So we're losing moths increasingly, and we need to do something about that, as Emilie was discussing. So we need to think about the future. I think many of the talks today have given us sort of grounds for optimism that we're doing things to try and turn the changes around. And we need to do that. We as humans depend on the natural environment for our our own continued existence. As H.G. Wells noted, we're no privileged exception to the general conditions that determine the destinies of living species. So what we do really matters, but there are causes for optimism, and there is so much more to learn about moths. Anyway, we sort of find new species even in the UK every year. So what I would like to conclude by saying is that, moths are incredible creatures, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted when I say that, we should pay attention to their populations, because actually, when we actually think about moths, the contents of our moth traps depend on all of nature, the whole history of life, and all of the interconnections. Thank you very much for listening, and also for caring about these wonderful insects.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was fascinating. Yeah, I can't get over the images and the quotes about the gypsy moth and the impact that had. That was quite incredible. Yeah, thank you very much, and that's fascinating presentation. Okay, I think we've reached the end of our meeting today. That just leaves me to say thank you very much to everyone who has delivered talks today, and everyone who's asked questions. We've had lots of questions in the chat and loads of comments. So thank you very much for engaging so much with today's meeting. I've also just put a link to a feedback form in the chat. So if any of you have any spare time to fill in our feedback form, that'd be fantastic, because we love to hear some comments and any ideas for any future meetings. That'd be brilliant. I will also be sending out an email to all of you next week with all the links that have been shared in the chat, so don't worry about noting them all down now, and some more information. And if any of you have any further questions to any of our speakers that haven't been answered today, then please let me know and I can pass them on as well. That just leaves me to say that I hope today has left you feeling inspired about moth recording, and hope we have a fantastic year for moths this year, 2026. So enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thank you very much for joining us.